Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today I'm here with my good friend Kyle Alander. Kyle has recently published a book called, or maybe not so recently, but like a few months ago, he published a book called The Educative Matrix, a Theodicy for the Universal Growth of All Beings. I was very happy to look at some of the rough drafts for that book and help Kyle with my own comments. And so Kyle today is here to talk about the methodology of the book, the theodicy that he proposes, and so we'll get into all the nitty-gritty details. But first, Kyle, how are you doing?
Good. I just finished college, so I
Nice.
got my bachelor's degree in philosophy. I'm going to be going into teaching, not teaching philosophy, but I'll become a high school teacher of some sorts. But
Mhm.
yeah, life is doing pretty well. Let's say that.
That's good to hear, Kyle.
Yep.
So, with this book that you've recently published, I know that you've kind of circled it around to various people. What have the reactions been so far?
Um, Relatively positive. I've had a few people reach out to me personally and tell me that this is what they were looking for in
Hmm.
terms of responding to the problem of evil. I've also I interviewed Trent Daugherty, who was the inspiration of the book, and he didn't give me his feedback, but he talked about there's a lot of similarities between his my book and his book, and then
Mhm.
overall, I got a lot. I also got some endorsements. So Pat Flynn did an endorsement. One of my old professors did an endorsement. So overall, it's been good. I haven't gotten any negative responses yet. Like I haven't gotten any criticism or pushback yet. I'm sure I will eventually, but for now it's been mostly positive, both from people I know personally and from the audience, that it's intended for. Um, so yeah, and then I recently went on Inspired Philosophy's channel to talk about it.
Right.
I didn't really get too much in the details there because his audience is sort of you know, not really built for the technical details of it, but I discussed at least the core arguments that I use. I didn't really get too much into the methodology, which hopefully we can get to that today to sort of get a little bit more detail on it. But yeah, that's mostly positive feedback, I would say.
Right. And just before we started the video, I remember you told me that a lot of Christians are and have responded to the logical problem of evil, but in terms of really dealing with the evidential problem of evil, that's another matter. And so I was wondering if you could begin then by just talking to us about these two versions of the problem of evil.
So it's interesting about these problems is I don't think that you could even though there is a distinction between the logical and the evidential problem of evil, I say in the book that I don't buy the distinction fully, and that's because I think that they're just I think they're both aspects of the same problem, but like to different degrees. So what I say is that what the logical problem is trying to do is say that the evidence of evil or the evil in the world is logically incompatible with theism, whereas the evidential problem is saying that it's just unlikely on theism. But as a Bayesian, what I try to do is I talk about those two terms in terms of probability. So the logical problem would be saying that the probability of evil given theism is zero, right? So the probability, like there is no world in which evil can exist and God could exist, right? Which is just another way of saying that the probability of evil given theism is zero, or the
Mhm.
probability of theism given evil is zero. Um, so that's the logical problem. But the evidential problem is just saying that it could be non-zero, but it's still going to be really low. So it's going to be low enough such that, you know, alternative hypotheses to theism like naturalism could explain it better. Ultimately, right, even though there is a real distinction between those two problems, like just in terms of how people talk about it, probabilistically, the only real distinction is in terms of degrees, not in terms of the kind of argument that it's trying to present. And this is something that I think is important to point out because I think any response that you have to the logical problem, may or may not apply to the evidential problem.
Mhm.
Whereas if you do have a response to the evidential problem, then it will apply to the logical problem. So, That's why in my book I mostly focus on the evidential problem, which I think if you solve the evidential problem, then you've effectively solved the logical problem. But yeah, now as far as your question goes with regards to, people talking about responding to the logical problem or the evidential problem. So this is what I see a lot of times in people that haven't studied this subject, where they'll make a video or something, right? And they'll be like, hey, you know, an atheist comes along and says, "Oh, evil is not compatible with theism," or "evil is unlikely on theism." And then what they'll do is, they'll present some reason that God may have to allow evil in the world, right? And they think, "Oh, well, that's all I really need to do. I just need to present a reason why God would do it." And of course, to me, I mean, sure, you can present a possible reason that might solve the logical problem, but it's not going to solve the eventual problem. And we can get into that if you want. But yeah, a lot of the times, popularizers that talk about this are really only addressing the logical problem. They're not really addressing the
Mhm.
evidential problem. The evidential problem is a much more serious objection that
Mhm.
has vast consequences. But yeah.
Right. And you're working, when you talk about the evidential problem of evil or the probabilistic problem of evil, you're using Bayesian epistemology, right, to deal with or cashing out the probabilities in question. And so maybe like if you'd like to give us just a bit of an introduction to Bayes' theorem, or what does the audience need to know about Bayes' theorem to understand what you're going to say in the next hour or so?
So yeah, so I wish I could show you. I actually have Bayes' theorem on my as one of my tattoos, but basically, how Bayes' theorem works is, and I'll just explain the odds form because I think that's easier for people to understand. So, on the odds form of Bayes' theorem, you have you draw. I wish I had something to draw it on, but like you have two, I guess, comparative factors. So you have the top or the denominator, which I believe is the bottom, which is the negation of the hypothesis, and then you have the numerator, which is the hypothesis itself. So you write it out, it's going to be that sort of thing. Now that's mathematically, right? Now you can talk about. Oh, are you sharing your screen?
Yeah,
There is
is
an
this
odds form. Yeah, so let me look up if you look up the odds form, that might be better for people to understand. But here's another way you could present it. Here, yeah, just put an odds form because that's one that I like to use.
how do I spell that? Is it odds?
Just
Like,
odd. Yeah, odd.
okay.
ODD. Yeah. Um, the second, the second one, the one with, yeah, that one. Perfect. So that's the one that I like to use because what it shows you, right, is you have the likelihood ratio, which is the one in the middle. Then you have the prior probabilities, which is the one on the far right. And then on the one on the far left, of course, is the posterior. So what's interesting is that the likelihood ratio is going to be determined by what evidence you put in. The prior probabilities typically are going to be based on, and I talk about this, but the priors are going to be based on, your background knowledge or your background evidence typically. And then the posterior is just when you multiply the two, right? So what this does is it's a mathematical model of how you evaluate evidence. That's really what Bayes' theorem is. Now, what's interesting, when I wrote the book, I explicitly don't do any advanced math because I feel like, people are gonna get confused about some of or at least like they're gonna get lost pretty quickly. So what I decided to do is, okay, you know, what I did in the book is I explained that the way that you evaluate these sorts of things is in terms of propositions, right? So the thing about how propositions work is, a proposition is a statement it's going to be a statement, it's going to be an opinion, right? It's typically just going to be a statement about the world, right? And if you look into the literature on Bayesian epistemology, um, most Bayesians hold to what's called the positive relevance thesis. And what that thesis states is that it's so basically it's defining what evidence is. So what is evidence? Well, evidence on the positive relevance thesis is basically the thesis where if you have um, proposition H, evidence for H is only evidence if and only it is evidence for H if and only if the probability of your hypothesis is more given H than without the evidence. So if you want a formal definition, let me see if I can find the positive relevance so that people don't get confused on what exactly it means, because I think it's important to point out, an actual formal definition. But hold on, let me see here. Where is that is weird. Why is the I should have oh, here it is. Okay. So in the book and page I think it's 40, well, on my I have the hard copy, so it's page 45. It might be different if you have the paperback, but what I say or what I cite Rocher on this, and what it says is that E is evidence for H if and only if the probability of H given E is greater than the probability of H. That is, if and only if E raises the probability of H above what it was when E was not taken into account. So that's what evidence is, right? And the thing is about evidence is that once you have that structure, then you can, you know, put that into your likelihood ratio, and then your priors are just going to be determined by whatever background evidence you might have. So evidence prior to, any new evidence you come across. Um, and I talk about this in the book, but there's four criteria that, at least that I find helpful when evaluating hypotheses. And that is, you want a hypothesis that has explanatory power. You want a hypothesis that is simple. You want a hypothesis that is ideally flexible, and then you want a hypothesis that is rationally coherent. Now, what do those terms mean? Well, one way to think about this is explanatory power is about the likelihood ratio. Simplicity is about your priors. Ideal flexibility is about Bayesian updating, so how you update your hypothesis given new evidence. And then rational coherence is just making sure that, your theory is internally consistent, doesn't entail any weird things or entail any absurdities, right? It doesn't entail the falsity of your theory, right? So that's basically what I think once you use those four criteria, um, then you can, plug that into Bayes' theorem, as it's presented here, and then use it as a way to calculate probabilities. So that's basically what Bayes' theorem is. And of course, there's more I can get into. Like there's different like there's standard Bayesianism. Like, there's degrees of, rational belief, but then there's also like degrees of support, which I adopt that view, and I actually give some example, well, not examples, but I talk about how there are certain, let's say, temporal um, constraints that people try to put on Bayes' theorem, which will apply in certain contexts. But what I argue is that actually temporal updating, so updating or what's called diachronic consistency constraints, I actually don't buy those. So I don't think you need diachronic conditionalization in order to do Bayes' theorem. There are some Bayesians that don't agree with me on that, but I just want to emphasize that even within Bayesianism, there are disagreements about the nitty-gritty details of how it all works. But overall, what I say is that, yeah, I'm using the Bayes method, the Bayesian method, when evaluating um, the evidence. And the good thing about this, before we continue, is that what this allows us to do is it allows us to actually get to what the problem is, okay? Because here's the thing with the evidential problem of evil, which is, well, the evidential problem of evil is supposed to be an argument against God's existence, which means that what it's trying to do is it's trying to actually disconfirm the hypothesis. So when you confirm a hypothesis, you increase the probability given evidence, right? But then if evidence comes along and decreases the probability, then that's called disconfirmation. So there's a symmetry there where you have confirmation, which is where you find evidence of a hypothesis, so you increase the probability. But then there's also something called disconfirmation, where you find evidence and it disconfirms your theory, so it decreases the probability, right? And what the evidential problem of evil is trying to do is it's trying to disconfirm theism, right? Um, and so what what that allows you to do is once you have a Bayesian framework of how evidence works, then when you evaluate the problem of evil, it's just an application of that, just more generally speaking. Now, of course, when it comes to theism specifically, there are additional principles that I employ when evaluating theism specifically, because theism is a very specific hypothesis, not just any hypothesis. But, that's just to sort of start off with, the overall meta framework that I'm using for the book.
Right.
I hope that helps the audience and yourself. But
How would you respond to somebody who says that, like for example, whenever somebody brings up that they're using Bayes' theorem, I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this. Some people might chuckle. I know some atheists have done this
yeah,
to like Christians who use Bayes' theorem, because I think in a lot of people's minds, the way that you evaluate probabilistic arguments is you kind of go off your hunch, your intuition, and they're waiting for that moment where I guess they hit reflective equilibrium and they're like, okay, yeah, now that sounds plausible to me. They think that's how like a probabilistic argument works. They're like, okay, I could see how somebody else could see it differently, but I really feel it here, this intuition that I have, or I've achieved reflective equilibrium with this model that you're proposing or this theodicy. What would you say to somebody who thinks that that's enough and we don't need Bayes' theorem when looking at the evidential problem of evil?
so I do think um, that's a really good point because I do think what that at least the way that you're describing it, I think that could be helpful for the likelihood ratio.
I see. Mm,
Um, but what Bayesianism does is it's trying to take into account all the factors, right? So what you just described might be useful for, let's say, explanatory power, but it's not going to be very useful for simplicity, right? So that's why the priors also have to be taken into account, right? Because I mean, one thing I don't get too much in the details in the book, but one thing that is important with the even the development of the Bayesian method itself is that the Bayesian method, in a sense, is just an outgrowing of the philosophy of science, or at least the philosophy of science in terms of our methods of science. Because if you look at the history of science, or at least the history of the methods of science, there's been a lot of, you know, development. So if you go back to the ancient, well, not ancient, but I guess early 20th century philosophy of science, you have logical positivism, right?
hmm
And then, that sort of goes away. And then you have what's called falsificationism, right, by Karl Popper. Then there's a lot of problems there, right? So then you go to Thomas Kuhn, who presents, a virtue-based system of how science should work, or at least the methods of science. In fact, there's a book, I forgot who the authors' names were, but there's a book called An Introduction to Scientific Method, or An Introduction to Theories of Scientific Method. And what they go in I can't remember if I cited it in my work, because there's a lot of literature on this, but at least if you look at the history of the methods of science, the Bayesian method is really just, a synthesis of all the best views, right? So, for example, like falsificationism, right? Most philosophers of science don't buy into falsificationism. However, in a Bayesian context, falsificationism is just disconfirmation, right? That's just one little aspect. So, in that sense, right, Karl Popper was partially right. He wasn't totally correct, in how he thought science worked, but at least he had an aspect of science, or at least he got something correct. And then we take what he got correct, and then integrate it within a larger system. Because I think every philosopher of science would agree. for example, like, hey, a good theory needs to have explanatory power. Like that's just basic knowledge, right? So that's just going to be in the likelihood ratio. But then you don't want a theory that's, completely unfalsifiable because then you wouldn't even have evidence. You couldn't even get evidence for it, right? This is I just want to, I won't get into the proof, but there is a proof that if you have an unfalsifiable hypothesis, so a hypothesis that there can never be any evidence against it, that you can also never have evidence for it, right? So what Bayesianism is really trying to do is it's trying to integrate all the best theories of how the scientific method works and trying to integrate it in such a way that you can actually mathematize these things and, evaluate them. So I do think that people that make that sort of objection, that you're bringing up are partially correct. Like, yes, I agree. There needs to be some intuition behind the fact that there's evidence for a hypothesis. In fact, I think all evidence, sort of works in that kind of way, right? There's always this intuition involved when evaluating whether some piece of data is evidence for a hypothesis. You can't, you can't get around that. But what Bayesianism does is it takes that important, correct aspect and integrates it into a larger system so that you can evaluate in the best way possible, right? So you can evaluate it um, in a way where it takes into account all of the best theories of scientific confirmation or scientific method that we have. Um, and I just, another thing I just want to mention, like Bayesianism is itself, it is a scientific, or at least it is a theory of scientific method. That's what it is, right? But what it really is it's really just a synthesis of different theories that you might find. Now, of course, I'm not going to get into each one because that would take way too long. But that's what Bayesianism is. It's just a system that has been developed through the history of the philosophy of science that really takes the best of the different theories and integrates them all in the best way possible. And one last thing is, the book that I referenced, so the one on the Introduction to Scientific Method, they go over all the different theories. And what they conclude is that, even though they don't fully endorse the Bayesian method, they do think it's the best one. So I just want to emphasize that there's a lot of philosophers of science that pretty much agree like Bayesianism is the best way to go on this because it's the best theory that we have of scientific method. So
Yeah.
yeah.
It looks like the book you're referencing is Theories of Scientific Method, an Introduction by Robert Nola and Howard Sankey. Is that right?
Um,
It's like with Rutledge 2007.
I don't have I have my phone with me. Let me, I have it in one of my, if you want to share your screen, you can, just so
Yeah,
I
sure.
making sure we're getting it right.
Just for the sake of the audience. Yeah, here you go.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So that's the book. And it's interesting is I actually read that book after I became a Bayesian, so I didn't even become I already knew that they were going to kind of conclude that Bayesianism was the best method that we had. But yeah, that's the book. And actually I think that book is probably the best philosophy of science book like ever, in my
Mm,
opinion. I just, you know, I think it's better than Thomas Kuhn's in a way because it really goes into all the historical details of, the philosophy of science and the different theories of scientific method. And I just one last thing I want to mention, is that when people talk about the scientific method, just like I think you recently did a video, Swan, on the
oh yeah.
historical critical method,
Right, right,
right?
right.
Well, what's interesting, just as the historical critical method has these different methods, right? The same thing applies to science. There's
Mm,
no one scientific method.
hmm,
There are different methods that scientists will use, and of course, Bayesian confirmation theory is just one of those.
right.
So I just want to emphasize that. But yeah,
Yeah, and the other thing I've heard too, just one last point on this, and then we'll move on to
yeah,
your theodicy. But people have said that Bayes' theorem, like when they hear Bayes' theorem, they think like it's this exotic, weird way of systematizing how we think about probability. But in reality, it's just distilling very clearly how we intuitively think about probability, right? Like we
Yeah.
take into account, prior probability, posterior probability, intrinsic probability, these sorts of things. We just don't, I mean, obviously, most people don't call it that in their day-to-day lives, but the concepts are there in how we basically think about probability. I just thought I'd mention that to kind of maybe, also build up your case.
Yeah, I mean, one last thing before, there's this interesting video by I'll give him a shout out, King Crocoduck. He now it's interesting because he's an atheist, so obviously, we're gonna have disagreements there. But he did a video a few years ago on, I think it was social constructionism. He was mainly responding to social constructionists, but one of the things that he talks about in that video is he actually, list out the four criteria that I mentioned earlier. So explanatory power, simplicity, flexibility, coherence. He lists those out, and all he says is like, hey, these are the big four criteria that we use to evaluate scientific theories. And what he argues is that all organisms on the planet do something like this. So that's just, further strengthens my case. I think that yeah, like this is just something that we just ordinarily do on a daily basis without even necessarily realizing it. So yeah.
All right, I want to give you now free reign to describe your theodicy. And I know that like for example, the my theodicy, like the two worlds theodicy, there's so many places where you can begin, and there's so many like interlocking parts. So, if you ever want to kind of like back up or, I don't know, start at a different point, whatever, just let me know. And I'll try to sit back and just recall if I remember everything from editing the theodicy the first time I looked at it.
Yeah. Yeah, so my theodicy is trying so here's the thing about the theodicy, which is what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to start off with what is the best kind of world? Because one of the things that theism, and this is, I guess I'll just briefly explain this, but what I define theism as is the proposition that there is an omnipotent being that acts on the basis of axiological reasons. Okay. So that's how I define theism. And if that's the case, there are two important characteristics of, you know, of that, or at least that are entailed from that. So the first characteristic is that you have a being that's all powerful. So um, God cannot fail to do an action. If he wants to do it, he's going to do it no matter what. But then more importantly is that with axiological reasons, well, God is all good. Okay, so that would mean that whatever God is motivated by is going to be motivated by goodness. So that's the second aspect. Now, if you put these two things together, what you're going to get is you're going to make a prediction from that, or I'd say you're going to make an ultimate prediction from that. And that is that God would create the best kind of world ensemble, if available, a very good world ensemble, if not. And at the very least, right, if those two options are, for some reason impossible for him to do, then he's going to create a world ensemble that is good on the whole. Okay. So that's the ultimate prediction that theism makes, right? So this is important because once we understand that fact that theism makes a very direct prediction about what the world might be like, then it's up to our theories of what best actions are that sort of fill in the details a little bit. So what I do in the book is I'm explicit. I'm like, hey, here are some values that I think would be a part of the best kind of world. Okay, and um let me see if I can actually find the uh the list, so to speak. Um okay, here we go. If you have a hard copy, it's on page 192, I believe. Yes. And if you have a paperback, it's somewhere else. But I talk about how, okay, so we know for a fact that if God exists, then he would be motivated to create the best kind of world ensemble. Okay. Then the question comes down to, well, what is the world ensemble? And that's going to be determined by your theory of value. So what I make very explicit is that your theory of value is going to determine everything. It's going to determine what theism predicts as a hypothesis. It's going to determine whether evil is even a problem for theism at all. And what I lay out is I lay out a list of things that I think would be a part of the best world ensemble. So I argue that the best kind of world is going to include saints, moral exemplars. The best kind of world is going to include personal virtue development. The best kind of world is going to include alethic values, right? Which we can get a little bit more into that later if you want. The best kind of world is going to include aesthetic values, so cosmic beauty, redemptive beauty. The best kind of world is going to include teleological values, so moral and spiritual progression. The best kind of world is going to include what I call an opportunistic matrix. So the universe um, is fundamentally oriented towards facilitating the unique development pathways of all beings, which is contingent on their free will, guiding them towards their fullest potential in alignment with the overarching cosmic evolution towards enhanced harmony and spiritual act. So that's basically a fancy way of saying, like, you know, God's going to create a world where there's opportunities for growth, there's opportunities for us to learn. Um, I say that the best kind of world is going to include incremental values, developmental values. The best kind of world is going to include relational values, and the best kind of world, of course, is going to include transcendental values like union with God, those sorts of things. Which we can get actually. Well, I won't spoil it, but what I argue is the ultimate purpose is union with God. But we can get into that later. And then, of course, value whole. So I created this long list in the very beginning of like, okay, these are what I think are going to these are going to be a part of what the best kind of world is. And what's interesting about that is once you include all that stuff, well, then you're going to need to invoke teleology into it. Okay. So I bring in principles of teleology like the principle of sufficient reason, real essentialism. In fact, some of these are from your own work, Suan. But I try to take as much as I can um, to really make explicit what exactly I'm assuming from the onset. Like, hey, this is my value theory. This is what I think the best kind of world is going to look like. And so once you have those elements in there, then the only question then becomes, okay, what is, if I want to get these kinds of values, what is going to be entailed from these things? Um, so what I argue is that the, well, I don't explicitly, I think I do talk about saint making, but what I really am trying to get at is the notion of um, that we live in an educative matrix. So we live in a world where suffering, it's not that suffering is something that just happens instrumentally, right? So it's not like, God causes suffering or, allows it just for instrumental ends, but rather God creates an environment where suffering can occur depending on our free choices. And then it's up to us whether how we want to respond to it. So one of the core asks, and of course, there's a lot more I can get into, but one of the core, most important aspects of my theodicy is actually I take from Viktor Frankl. So Viktor Frankl he was a Holocaust survivor. And one of the things in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, is that a lot of the times suffering is not something that just comes to us with ready-made meaning. So it's not something that just comes to us like as if it's going to necessarily cause negative harm to us, but rather it's gonna be what's going to determine whether it's ultimately good or bad for us is up to us. So what he says, I mean, I don't know if this is like a real quote or not, but one of the things that I emphasize is that when it comes to suffering, between stimulus and response, there is a space, and that space is our ability to choose our response. In our responses lies our growth and our freedom. So one of the things, or at least one of the main things that Viktor Frankl talks about is, you know, suffering is really there's like this, there's a stimulus, so there's suffering that happens, and then there's our response to it. And in between that, right, is going to determine, okay, whether the suffering is ultimately good or bad, or whether we can learn from it. And that's the opportunistic nature of the theodicy, which is it really takes that idea and is like, hey, here's an opportunity. Are you going to take it or not? And what happens, and of course there's evidence for this, is that if you respond in a certain way, then you become a saint of some kind, or you can learn and grow from it. If you don't respond in the right way, then that will lead to moral decay, right? Like there are certain individuals, I won't mention them, but there are certain individuals that they've gone through suffering, they didn't respond um, in the same way that saints might, and then they just morally decay from it, right? But notice how it's up to the creature how they want to respond. It's not the suffering itself doesn't determine that. So I just want to emphasize that point. But what I do in the book is I take that aspect of the theodicy and what I say is like, hey, when it comes to at least horrific suffering, which is I think that's like the big problem for theism, is that there is an opportunity for alethic growth from that. So I don't say that it's necessarily going to lead to alethic growth. I don't say that suffering is necessarily going to lead to saints or anything like that, right? So it's not instrumental, but rather that it can lead to that if a creature allows it to. So if they're in the right state of mind or that sort of thing. Um, and of course, there's more I can get into, but that's the important thing with the Theodicy is that, sorry, some people are messaging me. I don't want to get off track, but that's the important thing with Theodicy itself is that at least when it comes to horrific suffering, there are these alethic truth-telling experiences that can occur that people can learn from. And then, of course, when it comes to, lesser degrees of suffering, then, you might get saints out of that, right? But again, it all comes down to the individual. That's why it's the opportunistic matrix. So God is not using suffering as a means to an end. He's simply allowing it to occur in environments so that it's up to us how we want to respond to it.
Hmm.
And that what I argue, of course, is like in order to get these higher level virtues, they logically require like alethic truth telling experiences, like those logically require um, some kind of horrific suffering of some kind, of some sorts, or at least the within the range that we observe. Now, what I also emphasize, another core aspect of this, is that I propose, or I don't propose, but I borrow from Trent Dowder's paper on a subset of the best possible worlds, where he talks about Peter Van Inwagen's just disjunctive model of creation. So what that model of creation says is that God creates the initial world segment, right? And then how the world unfolds is largely up to the characteristics of that world. And so what that does is that at least when it comes to evil and suffering, it presents a range of suffering that can occur. Within that range, there's an opportunistic matrix, so you can grow from it, you can learn from it, or you can degrade from it, right? It's largely going to be up to the creature. And then another core aspect of the theodicy is the defeat condition. So the defeat condition says that an evil, God is justified in allowing for evil as long as it's defeatable. And so let me give you a formal definition of what the defeat condition is, just so that people, can understand it, or at least understand what it's claiming. Let me see here. Let's see, yada yada yada. Oh, and by the way, I do talk about the defeat condition prior to getting into my theodicy, but um, okay. So the defeat condition is that an evil is defeated when it is integrated as a constituent part of a valuable composable whole that not only outweighs the evil, but could not be as valuable as a whole without the evil. This defeat is realized through the opportunity granted to creatures where the future remains open and the creature's response determines how the evil is transformed into a greater good, allowing the potential for a richer, more meaningful whole. So I talk about like just to give an analogy, like you might have certain aesthetics evils within art, and that when a painter when you look at the full picture of the painting, you say, oh, actually, this evil, this aesthetic evil, even though it's ugly in isolation, when you zoom out, you can actually see the beauty of the full art piece. In the same way, right, when an evil happens to somebody, like that might be a big stain in their life, and it's certainly going to be something that's, just valuable. When you zoom out, you can actually see, oh, the person is able to learn and grow from it, and they don't necessarily regret what they went through. So those are the core aspects that's the core aspect of the theodicy, where basically God creates an initial world segment, and then from that initial world segment, the world indeterministically grows about, and then through the defeat condition, God has to ensure that the evils, you know, are within a range, right? And then within that range, people can learn and grow from not just from suffering, but they can also, become saints, right? Because the whole idea is that in order to get saints, it logically requires um, these kinds of evils to come about, or at least, like things like forgiveness, heroism. These higher level virtues cannot exist without there being evils in the world
Hmm.
for people to respond to them. Um, So that's the Odyssey in a nutshell. Now, of course, there's more I can get into, but that's like the most important aspects of the Theodicy itself. And just to be clear, I'm aware that there's a lot of objections that people might have, and I do address those in the book. And I address pretty much everything that I've not only found in the literature, but I address even stuff that I myself came up with. So
Hmm.
I do have a long, very long section addressing all the objections that might be thrown at the Theodicy. But yeah, that's basically what it is. It's basically, I mean, in one way you could say, because when Trent wrote his book, he calls his Theodicy the saint making Theodicy, and I call my Theodicy the educated matrix, or the educated evolving world Theodicy, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to ground his theodicy, so provide a sort of mechanism for his theodicy, but then also I'm trying to like expand it a little bit to account for more of the data, and of course keep it within a range. So, so that's the theodicy in a nutshell. That's how it works. If you have any questions, let me know. I could probably expand more on it, but yeah,
Right, because the I guess the way that you could falsify your theodicy is if there is, let's say, evil or some evil in the world that one could not potentially have become a saint from. Is that right? Would that be a
yes,
falsification?
yeah.
Okay.
I have a whole apodex going over what would falsify my theodicy. I mean, it's not just that would do it. It's also
Yeah,
certain entities that might do it. I call it Alander entities, which I'm not going to get into. But
sure.
yeah, if people are interested in how you would falsify my theodicy, there's a few ways you could do it. Um, so it's not unfalsifiable.
Right.
But yeah, that's an important thing to emphasize that my theodicy can certainly be falsified pretty quickly if someone's able to, find some evil that could never potentially, no one could become a saint from that or whatever.
Right. Because that seems to be like at the heart of when Marilyn McCord Adams wrote her book, on horrendous evils. What is it? And this is not a verbatim, quotation from her, but it's something like a horrendous evil is an evil where the victim, after experiencing it, no longer sees their life as like worth
Yep.
living. They no longer see any dignity in themselves.
Right. And so what the
Yeah,
defeat condition does is it's trying to reverse that perception of the
right.
evil, of the
Because
suffering that they went through.
because you're trying to say that there is no evil in principle that could, I guess, necessitate that result. So I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
In empirical terms, you could say here's this horrible case of suffering where the victim seems to have not recovered at all and wanted to like give up, or from what we can tell, they just gave up on life. Whereas, I mean, would you say then that, oh, here's an example of this saint who was like also horrifically tortured, but they became
Yeah.
saints
Well,
from the,
that's the
or
thing,
yeah,
right? So one of the
yeah,
things that I mentioned, because there is this one objection to my theodicy called the empirical adequacy objection.
mm,
And I address this in great detail, but one of the things that I say near the end of responding to that objection is that when it comes to evaluating evils, um, okay, I'll just bring up the Gordon Ramsay analogy, but one of the, like, okay, if some of you guys know who Gordon Ramsay is, he's a world-class chef, right? Let's say he's making a dish and he has all these ingredients, right? What he's going to try to do, he's going to try to integrate all those ingredients into a dish, right? In the same way, you could say that gratuitous evils are evils that haven't been integrated yet
mm,
into the value whole. Okay. And so, when you take that into account, then when it comes to evaluating empirically whether there are indefeasible evils, well, I think it's more interesting if you look at the class of evils. So let's take the class of evils, Holocaust evils.
yeah,
Well, okay, sure, we could take that class, but we already have a few individuals like Viktor Frankl, for example, that has alethically grown from that, right, from that experience. Same thing with certain, I don't know if I know Max Kolbe, perhaps, or some other saints that came out of the Holocaust that um, that we do know that people have within those situations have overcome their evils, have defeated their suffering. So because they're within the class, then the probability that all the other individuals within the Holocaust can overcome their suffering goes up, if that makes sense.
hmm,
Which, if that's the case, then it becomes much more difficult to argue that there truly is any indefeasible evils that have occurred.
right,
Just because of the fact that we have already observed those kinds of evils being defeated, then there's no in principle reason to think
mm,
that, the evils that other people have gone through can't also be defeated in some way. So yeah.
right. How would you respond to the concern that, well, because I don't think your theodicy is saying that, let's say somebody does give up on their life after a horrible evil. It's like
And suicide, yeah.
right, so, or what, however, that plays out. You can understand and even be sympathetic towards that response, right? Um,
Yep.
but I think somebody could wonder though, like, is a consequence of your theodicy victim blaming? If, for example, somebody doesn't recover, but then you go over here to this saint who did recover from maybe a comparable or similar evil, and then it's like, okay, well, then the problem is the person, who didn't, I guess, I don't know, have the muster to turn their
So
evil into
the
good.
theodicy doesn't really get into culpability
Right. Okay.
too much
Hmm.
because I think culpability is a more moral issue, and the theodicy doesn't make any moral claims about whether someone is culpable or not. All it's saying is that people can not respond the right way. It doesn't make them morally bad. Doesn't mean that they're
Mm,
a negative person or whatever. Um, all it means is like, they were ignorant in some way of how to overcome it,
sure.
right? And that's not, they can't be. So in terms of culpability, right, the theodicy doesn't really make those sorts of claims, right? That's why I think when it comes to any theodicy, I think you do need an eschaton, so you need an afterlife of some sorts.
Yeah. Hmm.
Because if you leave an evil undefeated
Right.
or with no potential to ever be defeated, then you're going to run into a problem.
Mm.
Um, with at least with God's obligation to ensure defeat, right? So any as John Hicks says, right? Any theodicy needs eschatology. Like you can't separate those
Right.
two. Um, Trent Dowdery has made the same point, and my theodicy also requires that as well. It does require an afterlife of some sorts. I also I do think, by the way, that it does require a physical resurrection. Um, so which is interesting because that's what Christianity teaches. So
Right.
I could just get physical resurrection just from theism itself, which is kind of crazy, but yeah. I do think um that that's how it works. And just one last thing, um, I guess is I should have said this earlier at the beginning, but this theodicy that I'm presenting is just from bare theism itself. So I don't have to, I don't need Christian doctrine for this to go through, if that makes sense. This is a purely, and I say this in the book, this is a purely natural theological project.
Right.
Um, but as a result of that project, I do think you get a physical resurrection from that. So, that might say something about the truth of Christianity, but anyways, that's all I have to say on that.
Right. I
So,
mean, no, that's really fascinating. Because well, I mean, one thing that surprised me about the problem of evil debate is just how, as Christians, at least, well, I know that you're not doing this you're not making the argument for only Christians.
yeah, yeah,
You're making it from a general natural theological standpoint. But on the one hand, it's like for Christians who do engage in the problem of evil, like our tradition, or at least, if you follow the traditional narrative, there are resources there. Not
yep,
everything is going to be sorted out in this life. And so when an atheist, sees somebody die in an unjust way or suffer in an unjust way in this life, and then they use that as evidence against theism, it's like, well, no, no, no. Like in theism, there's more than just this life. But then on top of that, given the fact that you are saying from natural theology, there has to be an afterlife, an eschaton, a final judgment, some sorting of things at the end of time, then that does lend credence down the line, I think, to like a Christian view of the world, even if that's not what you
yeah,
were going in to do necessarily.
yeah. And well, one thing I think Swinburne makes this kind of argument, although not as systematically as I do, but he does argue that, God would become incarnate. He has independent arguments for that.
Right.
But I talked to Trent Dowdery about this, and even he says, in his book that he's not even necessarily arguing for bare Christianism. He's just arguing like theism itself logically entails certain doctrines of Christianity, like sainthood, like
Mm,
an afterlife, those kind of things. Right. It doesn't necessarily it may not necessarily logically imply everything. Like
right.
it might not imply the Trinity or something, but it is going to logically imply an afterlife. It's going to logically imply saints, right? Depending on, your definition of what it, because like another thing too, I want to emphasize is that what I mean by a saint is not necessarily a Catholic saint. I just mean any moral exemplar. So that
Hmm.
could be from any religion. It doesn't have to be Christian.
Right.
Although I do think, the Catholic tradition does have the best examples of saints. So I just want to
Hmm.
emphasize that. But there are certainly saints that even I think that go beyond, the Catholic tradition.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about Buddhists and
Yeah.
Muslims and Hindus who have lived exemplary lives, so we shouldn't exclude that. And also, like, as you said before, I mean, for example, a Muslim person could also use this theodicy
Oh
because they
yes.
believe in a final judgment and so on and
I
so
think a
forth.
Muslim could 100% accept
Right,
everything I'm saying. So,
right, right.
yeah.
Well, Kyle, I think those are all the questions that I have. Do you want to expand on anything?
Yeah, so one of the things that is important when it comes to building a theodicy is, a lot of theodicies will sort of just present a theodicy like, all these reasons that God might have, but then they won't take into account the prior probabilities, right? So there's one objection that people will bring up, and that is the weighted averages objection. I actually think the weighted averages objection is the most important objection to any theodicy. Because what the weighted averages objection says is that, you have theism, but then you have this theodicy, so this story. So the problem, of course, is probabilistically when you conjoin these two things together, your priors are going to go way down, right? And that's true, right? If you just conjoin them together and don't do anything else, you don't try to like make any connections between those two, then yeah, your priors are going to go way down. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why I spent so much time addressing that in the book because hardly any Christian that talks about this actually tries to address it because they're like, oh, well, I'm a Christian, so, I can just, I already have my story that can explain all the evil. And that's true. You might have a story that can explain all the evil, right? You might be able to explain all the data, right? But you have to talk about the priors. Like, you're bringing in all these different things, all these different elements, and you're conjoining that to theism. Well, that's just going to bring your overall probability, like the overall probability of your hypothesis is just going to go down, right? And this is something that like hardly anybody addresses. Um, of course, I think the reason why they don't address it is because they just don't know about it, right? So, most Christians that go on the talk about the problem of evil, they just don't have the probabilistic background or the Bayesian background in order to understand the issues there. So when it comes to my theodicy, though, is I explicitly argue, and I have a framework for this. I'm not going to get into it today because that'd be too complicated, but I do talk about how, okay, theism is a hypothesis that God is all powerful, you know, and he wants to do actually logically good actions, like he's motivated by that. So my argument is essentially that you make a direct prediction that God would create the best kind of world ensemble. Like the probability that God creates a best kind of world ensemble is one. It's entailed from the hypothesis, given the definition of theism. It's entailed that God would create a best kind of world ensemble. And then all you have to do is just fill out the details of what that world ensemble is, right? And as long as the probability of those things are non-zero, and I present a very sophisticated like criteria to evaluate, how that all works. But once you have those details in, then okay, God will create the probability that God creates a world ensemble is one. Um, in fact, let me just so I can walk through the audience how this works. Um, I believe if you go to so there's two um parts to not parts to my theodicy, but two sides of my theodicy. So there's the defensive side where I explain the theodicy itself, right? But then there's the Bayesian or the comparative analysis assessment. So I believe it's on page 255. Um, and if you go here, I argue, like, okay, from the premise that God must create the best kind of world ensemble conducive to educational values, so that's T to K, then from K to SAE, from the value of sainthood, alethic experiences, and aesthetic goods, right? So the best kind of world ensemble is going to include those elements. But then, in order to get those elements, you're going to need significant trials and experiences for the realization of sainthood, truth-telling experiences, and the manifestation of aesthetic values. So then theism, through a simple theorem, entails, um, you know, the probability of those significant trials are one, and then so then the probability of evils given theism would be one, right? And then I say, someone may object that adding the educated matrix story to S, or sorry, Someone may object that adding the educated matrix story S to T bare theism lowers the probability of the theistic hypothesis so much that the advantage goes to naturalism. Notice though that 1 and 2 entail the lemma T to S, A, and E. Therefore, the probability of T is logically equivalent to the probability of T and S. Okay. Now, why is that important? Well, what I what I what I do is because the probability of T given S is 1, so the probability of my theodicy given theism is 1, then that opens the door to just what I call a fine-tuned argument of educative experiences. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, but I present in the book a fine-tuning argument from evil, or I guess from educative experiences, that shows that evil actually probabilistically supports theism over naturalism. So I don't know if you wanted to get into that because I thought that was, super important to point out, but
Well,
but yeah.
maybe we can touch on just to summarize what you're saying,
Yeah.
because it is true that once you start, let's say you have this bare hypothesis, and then you start adding other things, right? That does eventually like reduce the probability, because then you have
Yeah.
all these like multiple interlocking parts. That could, like what is that? I mean, is this is pretty similar to like the dwindling probabilities objection, right? If
Yeah,
it's
it's very
not the
simple. I mean,
same thing.
it's not the exact same thing, but
I see.
it's similar to that. Yeah.
Right. And what you're saying is that this it's not that you're adding things on to the hypothesis of bare theism. It's that bare theism itself bears these things out.
Yep.
And so, it'd be wrong to count this as just adding things on later when it's a consequence of the hypothesis in the first place. Right. And so I think that's the basic point you're making, if I'm not
Yeah, and in fact,
mistaken.
I use in order to strengthen my argument, I use a transitive mathematical framework to show that there is no way for this to decrease priors once you
Right.
have that. I'm not going to get into details of how that works, but yeah, I mean, I there is no mathematical way, given my framework, that my theodicy could decrease the prior probability. Um, so one way to think about why this is the case. Okay, so go back initially to the symmetry between confirmation and disconfirmation. So this is how it works. So if you really want to get super simple, Suan, this is how the entire thing works. Okay, so bear with me. So evil is presented as a disconfirmation. Okay, so that's the evidence problem of evil. What does the theodicy do? What a theodicy does is it disconfirms the disconfirmation. Well, okay, if the theodicy disconfirms the disconfirmation, so you get double disconfirmation, you're gonna get confirmation. Okay? That's the entire ball game right there. I mean, at the end of the day, that's all it really is, right? Is you have disconfirmation initially. The theodicy is presenting a disconfirmation of that disconfirmation, which then implies confirmation. So, um, now of course, a little caveat with that is you have to make sure that what theodicy you're using, actually does confirm your hypothesis, so it's likely on theism. But the whole point behind the narrative probability stuff that I go over in the book is that because theism entails that God would create a world ensemble, then theism entails that God would create a narrative. Okay? And so all that narrative is doing is just contextualizing the evil that occurs. That's all it's doing at the end of the day. So I hope that makes sense,
Hmm.
Swan. But at the end of the day, like it's really that simple. Like
Hmm.
that's all I'm really doing at the end of the day.
And
So
you wanted to bring up something about fine tuning, so maybe we'll have that be our last point. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so there's I present a fine-tuning argument, um not the traditional fine-tuning argument, but a fine-tuning argument from educative experiences, which I argue, educative experiences is the environment by which evil occurs. So really it's, a fine-tuning argument from evil. But what the important thing about that argument is basically just saying like, hey, theism predicts a world ensemble. Theism predicts this educated matrix, right? So, when it comes to narrowing down the probability spaces, or at least narrowing the range, right, of the evils that could occur, then, um, you don't want to have too much evil because then that would entail, you know, indifferent. I think, yeah, it would just entail, um, indefeasibility. But then you don't want to have too little evil because then those higher level goods won't come about. So you need a fine-tuned range of evil. And my argument is basically like, okay, you need this fine-tuned range. You need just enough evil to make sure that people can respond in the right way. Um, but naturalism, of course, the hypothesis of a difference, the hypothesis that, you know, there is non-intentional substances, non-normative substances governing Christian change. Well, that doesn't make any predictions about, you know, the distribution of moral properties or something. Like, it doesn't make any kind of predictions about moral properties like virtues or like it doesn't predict any of that, right? So its range is going to be super duper wide, whereas theism makes a much more narrow prediction. And so once you find that once we find ourselves in that narrower prediction, then that's what we would expect for theism to be true. Another way to talk about it, which I find very helpful, is let's say you draw a circle, so that represents the entire probability space of all evils that could ever occur, all possible evils. Um, Now someone might say, okay, well, evils in that broader range is disconfirms theism. And that might be true, but what the argument is showing is like actually we observe ourselves in this very specific range of evils over here. That's a part of the larger circle. But theism predicts this this much smaller circle within a corner here or something, right? And just using an analogy. And we observe ourselves in that narrow range. And so the whole point, right, is that theism actually predicts that narrow range, whereas, naturalism is going to be much more wide in terms of what it might predict in terms of the distribution of evils. So that's another way you could think about it, but yeah, it is very similar to a fine-tuning argument, because it's basically saying like, hey, there needs to be a certain distribution of evils that occur such that it's not too much and it's not too little. It's just right. And then, once you can establish that, then all you have to do for probabilistic confirmation is to say like, hey, we observe ourselves in that range. Um, what does naturalism predict? Well, naturalism doesn't make any predictions about moral properties, so it's gonna lose when it comes to the actual distribution of evils. So that's why the thesis of my book, um, that's why I argue that evil and divine hiddenness are indirect evidence for theism. Is because really it is once you understand, that aspect of it. But yeah.
All right. For those of you who've been listening today or watching, you can find Kyle's book on Amazon. Is this the preferred place where you prefer people to buy it, or is there
Oh yeah,
another?
yeah. Just buy it on Amazon, yeah, because that's how I don't have it any I don't have it on any publisher's website yet, although I do hope to get one soon. But
Sure.
but yeah, just buy it on Amazon. That's the easiest way to get it.
Right. The Educative Matrix, a Theodicy for the Universal Growth of All Beings. You can find it on Amazon. And Kyle, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.